Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this year's ASEF, the first face-to-face event since the pandemic. And so I'm becoming new again into this event after doing this virtually, which was also comfortable at that time. So my name is Cindy Cisneros-Tiangco. I'm a principal energy specialist at ADB. So the context for this year's ASEF is that over the past couple of years, we have seen the mainstreaming of carbon neutrality, as many countries have committed to net zero targets and have set more ambitious, nationally determined contributions. The pledges of countries and corporations to carbon neutrality are welcome. They represent a revitalization of commitments made to the Paris Climate Agreement. ADB commits to full alignment to the Paris Agreement by 2025 and is well on its way to becoming the region's climate bank. We heard from our president this morning that we have a target of $100 billion in climate financing up to 2030, and including $5 billion for healthy oceans by 2024. So this year's ASEF theme is very close to my heart, as I've been working to innovate in the clean energy space for over 2 decades. I have been involved in ASEF since its first in 2005, actually. And I'm excited to co-chair this track 4 on innovative and resilient renewable energy. Track 4 focuses on current and future trends in renewable energy, innovative business models and financing mechanisms, digitalization, and mini-grids. Let me introduce my co-chair, Takuya Sakai. So Taki and I reviewed over 100 abstracts, and we hope that the presentations we curated for you today will speak to you. So the future of renewable energy in Asia and Pacific looks promising, as countries in the region are increasingly focusing on sustainable and clean energy solutions. Our first speaker will talk about floating solar technical assessments in Southeast Asia, followed by our second speaker who will talk about nearshore marine floating solar. And our third speaker will talk about offshore floating wind. And finally, our last speaker will talk about power systems resilience in the face of increasing renewable energy contribution. After all the presentations, we will have a panel discussion followed by an open floor for Q&A. You can ask your questions live, or you could also use the Events Air app to write your questions, and I'll be monitoring those for the Q&A later. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Ms. Sika Gazanku. She's an energy, technology, and policy researcher and project lead for floating solar projects at the US Department of Energy National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. Her presentation summarizes findings from a new floating solar technical potential assessment for Southeast Asia. Over to you, Sika.
Thank you, everyone, for joining the session today. As Cindy mentioned, my name is Sika Gajankwim, and I'm a researcher and project lead for floating solar projects at NREL. Today, I'll be talking through a very new study we've done on technical potential assessment for floating solar in Southeast Asia specifically. On this slide, I just want to highlight the team effort that this work was, and also thank our funder, USAID Regional Development Mission for Asia, for funding this work. Okay, great. So in this presentation, I'll provide a motivation for the study, briefly explain what floating solar is, and then I'll talk through a research approach, briefly touching on our data collection process and our analysis scenarios. I'll then provide an overview of our results on a regional level and provide a few examples on the country-specific level as well. And I'll end with some key takeaways and next steps. Okay. Oh, waiting for the slides to advance. Okay, I'll just talk through, and if the team can advance the slides, that would be great. So the next slide talks through the motivation for this study. And NREL is a national lab, one of 17 US DOE national labs, and our work in the Southeast Asia region is really demand-driven. A few years ago, we had several stakeholders coming to us, asking us questions about floating solar and the opportunity space for Southeast Asia specifically. So the figure you see on your left is the visualization of the countries that were included in our assessment, our floating solar assessment. And it was really also driven by goals in the ASEAN region, specifically the 2025 goal of having 35% of renewable energy in terms of installed total capacity. And so floating solar has really emerged as an option to leverage existing hydropower resources while meeting the region's growing electricity demand and also aligning with the region's energy security objectives, specifically when we think about electricity reliability and resiliency. And also, again, aligning with the region's renewable energy targets. So this work is important because it provides an estimate of what the technical potential for floating solar could look like across the region. And we also provide country-specific results as well. So some of you might have questions about what technical potential is. And so the next few slides, if we can proceed to the next slide, we'll talk through our data collection process and our analysis scenarios as well. So when we're thinking about technical potential, it's a very conservative estimate of what the capacity, whether it's in gigawatt or generation, when you're thinking about terawatt hour on an annual basis, what it looks like for a specific technology. And what that looks like for the technology after accounting for different constraints and system performance. So what is floating solar? Simply, it's solar sited on water bodies, be that lakes, reservoirs, water treatment ponds. There's a lot of interest in floating solar for a few different reasons, including the increased panel efficiency because you're siting the panel on a body of water, and also the reduced or avoided land use, which is really important in countries where land is expensive, it's scarce, or there are other pressures such as housing and agriculture that demand looking for innovative options. And then also when you pair floating solar with hydropower, there are also the benefits of water conservation and reduced solar PV curtailment. So on this slide, I show two different figures of the main ways we're seeing floating solar be installed. So they're being installed as a standalone system, so a system operated independently, or a hybrid system. And the main hybrid configuration we're seeing is solar paired with solar PV paired with hydropower. And so describing what the system actually looks like and how it operates, you have PV panels, same like the panels you use in the land-based PV industry, situated on floats, if you just look at that top figure. And then they're secured to the bottom or the shore of the water body using mooring and anchoring lines. And then that whole system is connected to a central inverter, and that is connected to the transmission or the grid on land. If we go to the next slide, in terms of our research approach, when it comes to data collection, we spoke with several stakeholders across the region to try and get a sense of what are the priorities when it comes to understanding the floating solar opportunity in Southeast Asia specifically. So over several months, we started to get a sense of what data is available and what analysis scenarios of interest. Can we proceed to the next slide? Great, thank you. So there are three main data sets we looked to collect during this process. The first was on water bodies, the second was on infrastructure, and the third was on solar resource data. When it comes to water bodies, our work focused on artificial water bodies, usually referred to as reservoirs, and natural water bodies. So those are the two main data sets we relied on. At NREL, all of our work is publicly available, so we try to find data sets that can be accessed by everyone. The second bucket of data sets, infrastructure, are often proxies for kind of identifying which areas, in this case of water bodies, can actually be developed for FPV. So we focused on transmission lines, access to roads, and protected areas as proxies for whether a site could potentially host floating solar or not. And then finally, in terms of the solar energy resource data, we use data from the ARI Data Explorer tool. Sadie Cox highlighted it in her presentation today. We released high fidelity, high quality data for the Southeast Asia region a few years ago, and so we leveraged that for this analysis as well. So moving to the analysis scenarios we considered in this work. Next slide, please. Thank you. We had two main focus areas, the water body type and the FPV technology. So everything in green is what was included in our analysis, and what was in orange is what was excluded, again, based on stakeholder input. So for water bodies, we focused on those two groups I mentioned in the previous slide, artificial water bodies and natural water bodies. And for FPV technologies, we looked at fixed tilt, monofacial, and bifacial. So almost all existing floating solar projects use monofacial PV panels, but in the land-based PV industry, there's increased use of bifacial PV panels. So we wanted to represent that in this analysis. And bifacial allows absorption of sunlight on both sides of the panels, but it does have an increased cost. Nevertheless, the research we're seeing does show an increase in output from the system, and so it was included in this analysis. Next slide. In terms of how we actually calculate technical potential, I'll walk through this quickly, but happy to answer questions after the presentation. We excluded certain areas, for example, water bodies in protected areas, and also excluded water bodies that were too far away from roads. And then we also had some sensitivities around distance. So assumptions around kind of excluding water bodies that may be too shallow or too deep, because that can be a proxy for how expensive it would be to develop a project. And then we used NREL's established technical potential methodology to estimate the capacity in gigawatts and then generation as well on an annual basis for each water body in our final data set. So next slide for actual results. So the next two slides summarize our findings on a visual basis. So the first is for those artificial water bodies for reservoirs. The figure you see is the summary of the technical potential for the Southeast Asia region we modeled in this work. And so the really deep red suggests the highest technical potential in our data set. So in this context, Thailand has the highest technical potential. In terms of the summary of water bodies in this data set, it was 88 water bodies, and you see the accompanying total area technical potential in terms of capacity and then generation. And then moving to the next slide, also looking at natural water bodies, here we had a much larger data set. So we had about 7,200 water bodies identified. But bear in mind, this is a mix of really small water bodies and much larger ones. And here as well, we see different countries with a variation in terms of technical potential. Indonesia, highlighted in deep red, has significant technical potential. So for our final slide, high-level takeaways, our work estimated that looking at reservoirs, there's a technical potential of about 134 to 278 gigawatts. And looking at natural water bodies, it's about 340 to 770 gigawatts. So to put this number in context, the ASEAN region expects to deploy around 235 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. And by 2050, it's expected to grow to 1,300 gigawatts. So our work suggests that floating solar could play a significant role in the region meeting its energy needs. We do want to note that technical potential is often the very first step, that much more detailed analysis would be needed to establish whether specific sites could actually be feasible when it comes to economics and other factors for deploying floating solar. Our work also identified additional areas for future research, specifically more detailed representation of bifacial FPV, offshore FPV. My colleague will be briefly touching on that in his presentation, and then aquaculture and PV. In the region, we know there's a lot of interest and there's a huge aquaculture industry. And so there's an opportunity to really align both of those. So happy to answer any questions. Thank you for listening. And we did publish a full report of this work. And so the final slide provides a link to that full report. And that report has detailed results for every country we looked at, in addition to the regional reports. And the final thing I'll note is that the data is publicly available at the ARI Data Explorer tool. So you can go and download that data and use it for any other analysis you would like to conduct. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sika. I'm sure your presentation and your database will be very interesting to many stakeholders here in the room. So our next speaker is Agustino. Agustino Miguel Garcia is a physics engineer with a master's degree in solar power and over 20 years experience working with governments, multilateral financing institutions, and the private sector. He has taken part in the development of over 50 floating solar or PV solar projects, and is working in 5 continents and in more than 50 countries, including several countries in the Pacific. So Yasuni will talk about the floating solar potential and the roadmap in the Pacific, and focusing on projects that are under development right now. Agustino.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much, Cindy, for the presentation and the introduction. I think I have to tell the slides. So I actually have quite a few slides, so it's going to be mostly a story. And I hope that people who got more interested, then we can talk or can also take a look in more detail at the slides. So first of all, this is substantially based on the technical assistance of ADB 6680, which is looking at 11 Pacific Island states and looking at developing FPV roadmaps in each of them to identify projects that can be developed. So, of course, acknowledge to the Clean Energy Financing Partnership Facility through the Asian Clean Energy Fund, established by the government of Japan, and the Clean Energy Fund with financing partners of governments of Australia, Norway, Spain, Sweden, and United Kingdom, administered by the Asian Development Bank. Next slide. So basically and this was a bit the guidance we got from ADB, first priority countries, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Tonga, two of them with public sector developments, Tonga with the private sector development. The other ones developed between the second and third priority. It's just priorities in development. There is nothing wrong with the countries, or one's more advanced or less than the others. Basically what you will see on my presentation is that we've been able to move forward with the first priority countries, and some of the other countries we are also in the progress of identifying and presenting opportunities. Next slide. So my colleague Zika has already actually quite interestingly showed how GIS and how this whole approach can provide and identify sites and opportunities. So we've done exactly the same thing in the Pacific, in each of these countries, and try to identify where could we actually develop and site the FPV plants in the best way possible. So there was kind of 4 cornerstones that we had. So one, to basically analyze and have this GIS approach. Secondly, to look at the grid connection, something that actually Zika did not mention, but that was one of the important parts for us. So we would need to have the grid available in terms of what we would like to do. Third is looking at the electrical load and how actually do we integrate the FPV. And the fourth, the policy environment and how to make sure that potential siting and the policy were aligned in terms of going forward. Next slide. So our big concept for the Pacific Islands is not on water bodies, is not on natural water bodies, it's actually on near shore. And what we would like to capture is the unique opportunity that we have to look at lagoons and the inner lagoons of these atolls, because they are all formed obviously on the top of volcanoes. So they have lagoons that can be tapped that are actually much better conditions than what we call the ocean side. So what you see here is basically a concept where we have a reef, and the reef is intended to be something that we are going to help develop and reestablish an ecosystem. We'll have a wave breaker that will protect our floating PV, and then we have our floating PV structure. Zico already explained floating PV extremely well. I think everyone here probably is also familiar. So the idea is that in these cases, we do have circumstances where we have waves or situations or severe weather events that put into danger the floating solar. So the idea of having the reef and the wave breaker is basically to take into consideration all of those situations. So the first country, Kiribati, it's an example. This is how we mapped a little bit what would be the needs in terms of political needs and policy, and what our FPV or the FPV size could be. So in the case of Kiribati, next one, we basically are doing a 4 megawatt FPV plant. That's going to be the first. It's going to be located next to the port at Besso, and it's actually coupled with much more than just a floating PV. So it's a floating PV. There's also ground-mounted PV. There's battery storage, and there's also a grid upgrade. All of that comes together with FPV when you want to actually, of course, increase the penetration of renewables in these setups and these islands. And in this case, this is a good example of how actually one FPV led to many more also other types of investments. I'll be talking about productive uses of energy as well. So we are looking also to have the FPV enabling socioeconomic opportunities, not only generating power, but generating socioeconomic opportunities based on the power that is provided. So in this case, we are looking at electrical mobility and the reef regeneration coupled with objective of coastal protection and regenerate the ecosystem to provide, of course, fishing opportunities for the local people. So this is a little bit what we are planning there, but of course we are hopefully to tender that during this year. So this is an opportunity, upcoming opportunity for all of you interested. And this is how we, at least on indicative design, it's going to look like. Small islands. So it's not the big islands that probably some of you have seen. Small islands because we have to cater for a lot of nearshore related issues. I'll be happy to talk to you about that. So we have incorporated a couple of solutions to make sure that we actually build up resilience on our proposed solution. You can also see a little bit wave breaker there. And second country was Tuvalu, much smaller than Kiribati, even in the context of the Pacific. Here we are doing 1 megawatt. Next slide. It's also the same setup. We would like to replicate the same idea, but of course in a smaller scale. Here in the case of the productive uses of energy, we are looking at electrical boats, and we will also be looking at, again, regenerating the reef and providing opportunities in terms of fishing for the local people. Same idea as before, this case 2 islands, and we will have also our wave breaker, and we will be using east-west configuration in this particular, setup. In Tonga, we are looking at, as I mentioned, a private sector development. 5 megawatts is our target. This is still under progress. We have identified some potential sites. We're probably narrowing and zeroing on site number 1 here, Papua, near the diesel power station. We also have already moved on concepts with the Federated States of Micronesia. And here you see that Micronesia has a potential quite high of having more floating PV in each of the states. And we will see, for example, in Chuuk, we have a huge opportunity in terms of still adding to the project that is now being done next to the airport. We have another one in Kosrae that we already identified north of main station. Pohnpei, near the airport. We are also in conversation and also have a positive feedback from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, where we identified also opportunities. So this one is north of Majuro. We've also identified other sites in RMI. Cook Islands, very interesting development, very different setup than the other ones. And we were also able to identify also opportunities in the Cook Islands that have been validated as well. So one near Avarua in Rarotonga. Next one. And my last slides are for the productive uses of energy and how we link this with the nexus. So we looked at food, water, mobility, transportation, and circular economy. And we looked at electricity. How can we combine both? Everything of this is necessary in these islands. Everything is necessary for sustainable and blue development, clean development. So how do we actually provide this and enable that? So we've been linking and looking at opportunities to look at food. So you've seen already, which is the reef. We are looking also at aquaculture and all the other vertical farming opportunities as well. In terms of the water nexus, of course, desalination is the main objective. It's very well connected with electricity. It also provides storage as well. So you can actually desalinate more when you have more power and desalinate less when you don't have so much power. So that by itself is a great advantage and in terms of integration of electricity. wait, just a second. Then on the circular economy, there's a lot that can be done. And transportation, looking at mostly hydrogen. This is what we have in mind. And this is a broader application, which can take us very far. And don't forget, they are small island states, but they are very large ocean states. So this is entirely a big opportunity for them. And the last one is on mobility. We believe that, there is a good and excellent opportunity there to bring on any type of electrical vehicles, being it boats, 3 cycles, 4 cycles, 2-wheelers, scooters, everything. And this would be excellent business models for the youth to develop and build their spin-offs and their startups. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Agustino. So this area is where ADB is going forward with cross-sectoral integrated solutions, addressing several and multiple interrelated challenges in the region. So the next speaker will talk about offshore floating wind. Morgan Krennis. Morgan is in charge of the innovation team at Enerdata, an independent energy consulting company based in France with an office in Singapore. He is involved in energy market studies, sectoral decarbonization studies, and on-the-shelf products such as comprehensive global power plant databases. Previously, Morgan has been involved in long-term modeling of energy and climate scenarios. Over to you, Morgan.
Thanks very much, Cindy, for this introduction. And thanks very much, Sika and Agostinho, for your insightful presentation. So now I will present another floating technology, but this time it will be about wind. And why it's a key technology? Because with floating wind, you can reach new areas, new locations. You can break free from water depth limitation, which is very, very interesting for Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. So we'll start by presenting the main technologies, competitiveness of those technologies. What's the role of renewables and floating wind to achieve a deep decarbonization objective? And then a few words about potential for floating wind in Asia. And it will be quite interesting to compare the figures with Sika's presentation. So what are the technologies? We have 3 main technologies. The first ever floating wind offshore project was installed in Norway in 2009, and it was using a spar foundation. So basically, it's a pencil buoy foundation with a very large draft, up to 100 meters. It means that from the bottom of the foundation to the top of the turbine, you have almost 300 meters, which is huge. No, sorry, can you go back? Yeah. So then you have semi-submersible foundation. So it's very large structure, 100 meters per 100 meters. So far, it's the most used technologies. And then the last technology is TLP, tension leg platform. So some cables, tendons are anchored to the seabed to ensure the stability of the system. Next slide, please. So now a few words about competitiveness. Here you have a few figures about levelized cost of electricity. So typically how much it costs to generate 1 megawatt-hour in average over the lifetime of the technology. And currently with floating offshore wind, we stand at around $150, $200 per megawatt-hour. But if we look to recent auction, typically in France, it decreased quite fast. And now we have LCOE of around 110, 120 euros per megawatt-hour. And in 2030, we could converge toward bottom fixed wind levelized cost of electricity. We should go back to the, yeah. So maybe in some location where it would be favorable for floating wind. Okay, no, we can keep on this slide. So the main difference, if you go back, sorry. So the main difference with bottom fixed wind technology is that in terms of capex distribution, 2/3 of the capex coming from foundation for floating wind, and it's only 1/3 for bottom fixed technologies. And another important parameter is about the capacity factor. for floating wind, you could achieve almost 60% of capacity factor, which is huge. In average, for bottom fixed technology, it's about 38%. So it's a good improvement. Next slide, please. So now we'll step back a little bit. I presented the main technologies. And now, so how we can achieve net zero targets, deep decarbonization objective. There are many different levels. This morning in the plenary session, some of those levels were addressed. And one pillar will be electrification, because electrification plays on both energy efficiency and decarbonization of the power system. So currently, the share of electricity in the energy end use across the world is at around 20%, and it could increase up to 50% in 2050. And in terms of power generation decarbonization, if you look at the graph on the right side, you have several deep decarbonization scenarios. And in all the scenarios, you have a huge amount of wind, around one quarter of total installed capacity in 2050 are coming from wind. Next slide, please. Okay, now we'll focus on Asia Pacific region. So here you have additional power capacities up to 2050. And you can see that, of course, it will be dominated by renewable energy if we are looking at a deep decarbonization scenario. And regarding those renewable energy, wind could account for 1/3 of total installed capacity. And now if we focus on wind, you can see that floating offshore could reach almost 20% of total offshore capacities. So it could mean that up to 300 gigawatts could be installed in Asia Pacific in 2050. So it's a huge number. It's not a prediction. It's not the most realistic scenario. We are here. It's a more what if scenario if we achieve deep decarbonization objective and if floating offshore overcome all the challenges. Okay, next slide, please. So now, if we look at what is in the pipe in the midterm, here you have all the projects so far. You can see that in 2030, we could have almost 40 gigawatts of floating offshore wind that could be installed around the world. Currently, we have only 200 megawatts installed, so it's a huge increase. And in terms of location, you can see that the UK and Europe could play a significant role. The US as well, but at the end of the period. And in Asia, we have very big players with South Korea, especially South Korea, Taipei, China, and Japan, and of course, People's Republic of China. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. And now a few words about the potential. So what is very interesting with floating wind is that it's evenly distributed across the world. So here you have the potential for bottom fixed wind. So it's in purple, and it's in blue, sorry. And in purple, you will have the potential for floating offshore wind. So you can see that Asia Pacific have very good potential. Europe as well, and North America. So, so those figures have been calculated using different parameters, as you can see here. So the key message here is that for shallow water, that can be very suitable for bottom fixed wind. You can see that's only located in Europe, basically. Yeah. And for floating wind, you can see that the potential is very well distributed. So if we go to the next slide, please. So now we focus on Southeast Asia, except People's Republic of China and Vietnam, which have good potential for bottom fixed wind. You can see that all the other countries, they will rely more on floating wind in terms of potential. So potential for floating wind could reach 5 terawatts. And fixed wind is about 2 terawatts in the region. So it could be interesting to compare those figures with FPV. I think the potential, it was more hundreds of gigawatts in the region. So it's interesting to see this. And another important fact is that the industry has developed a T-class turbine. It means that it could face a typhoon, which is very important for this region. Okay, now if we move to the next slide. So here, the key takeaway. So I think the first important message is that with floating wind, you can have access to new areas, evenly distributed across the world. Second message is that in terms of capacity to be installed in a favorable scenario, in a deep decarbonization scenario, you could reach very high installed capacities, and it could account for almost 20% of total offshore wind projects. Asia could account for 20% of total floating offshore wind projects also. In terms of competitiveness, it could be competitive by 2030 in some areas. And I would say that next step for floating wind will be to scale up. Currently, we have pilot projects, small projects about 30 megawatts. So next step will be to go for gigawatt projects. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Morgan. So as you can see, the energy sector landscape is changing. It's going into the water. So I'll say it's a waterscape now. Our final speaker is Christophe Napes. Christophe graduated from University College London and Essex Business School, has worked in Japan and France, where he has been involved in renewables, energy efficiency, high voltage grids, and rural electrification. He is currently Director for Power Systems at EDF's R&D Asia Center, based in Singapore. Over to you, Christophe.
Thank you very much, Cindy. So could we have the first slide, please? So my presentation is called Power System Resilience in Asia, How to Ensure that Energy Transition Doesn't Collapse Our World. So it's a fairly dramatic title, I think, to draw the attention of the panel. Next slide, please. So the challenge which I'm addressing today is energy transition. So Asia faces a huge challenge, 60% of the world's population, reliance on carbonated energy sources, coal and gas, and a geography which is complex with many island states and mountains. So energy transition challenges us in terms of how to mobilize capital, how to transfer employment, and also how to evolve the supply chains. But there is also a systemic issue which is to do with the grids and the grid infrastructure. How stable can the grid be? And when we have a lot of variable renewable energies, how can we ensure that the system does not collapse? So next slide, please. Very quickly about EDF, which is the French national electrical company. So we have about 165,000 employees. We're mostly in France, but also around the world, involved in projects, including in Asia. In Europe, we have an interesting position because France is quite central geographically. And we have 37 interconnectors with neighboring countries, with a capacity of up to 14 gigawatts of energy exchange. Next slide, please. So energy transition usually encourages countries or systems to do one or several of the following things. So they close down coal-fired power plants, diesel generators, or they convert them to less carbon-intensive operation. They close down gas-fired power plants or transfer them to less carbon-intensive operation. They encourage stable renewable energies such as hydro, biomass, geothermal, marine. They encourage variable renewable energy sources such as photovoltaics and wind turbines. And in some cases, they may encourage the development of nuclear power. Next slide, please. So as you know, the risks are linked to the fact that electricity needs to be balanced in real time. Currently, system stability is maintained through centralized power sources that are easy to dispatch and generally respond quickly. This balance is fragile, however, and there are collapses do occur. So blackouts in the table at the bottom of the slide, you can see some examples of some of the major ones, major blackouts, which sometimes impacted tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of people. So when we introduce a high level of variable renewable energies, this impacts the system. It can create imbalance, but human activity is dependent on electricity. So it's important to avoid as much as possible. Next slide, please. So our suggestions, we have three main areas in which we feel need to be looked at to mitigate these risks. So the first one is balancing the energy mix. So in terms of variable renewable energies, we need to, where possible, have both solar power and wind, helping to mitigate this risk. The traditional dispatchable power sources, in particular hydrocarbon-based, should be as varied as possible because they're subject to price variations and geopolitical problems. Dispatchable renewable energies such as hydro, marine biomass should be encouraged because they're both environmentally friendly and easier to control. And in certain cases, if the political and logistical conditions are present, then including nuclear power in the mix can help. Next slide, please. So the grid infrastructure, this is an important one for us. We consider that the resilience of the grids can be increased by reinforcing the grids. It gives access to backup electricity. European system is a good example of this, where most of Europe, or all of Europe, in fact, is interconnected. There are projects and programs around the world, and on the next slide, I'll show some of these. In practice, however, it's not easy to develop the grid, particularly between countries, because there are geopolitical concerns. Sometimes countries don't get along or feel they don't want to depend on each other. Also, there's a question about the cost benefit, who pays and who gets paid. So these are existing interconnections in the region. It looks quite impressive, but in fact, many of these are very fragile and have very little transmitting capacity. Next slide, please. There are many projects and many groups of countries working together. In the region, we have ASEAN. We also have the Greater Mekong sub-region, and then there's NAPSI around Mongolia and China and Russia. But in fact, if we really want to improve things, we need to go much faster than we are currently. And the barriers, as I mentioned before, are geopolitics and the cost-benefit sharing. Next slide, please. So the third area in which we believe there can be a significant effort to overcome these risks is management of the energy flows. So you can increase flexibility in the system by having battery storage and pumped hydropower as a balancing tool. Energy flow control currently or traditionally is very centralized and based on a limited number of large generators. We need to evolve towards a finer tuned real-time control. As generators become more distributed, you need to look at a local level while keeping an overall view. But thanks to modern computing and data analysis, we can really improve the quantity of data that we can treat and also the quality of the analysis that we can make. Energy markets can also play a role where they're present because we can encourage players towards more flexibility depending on the market rules which we put into place. Next slide, please, which is the last one. So just as a recap, the risk is systemic, and energy transition means closing down carbon-based power plants, moving towards less easy to control and more distributed renewables. The current electric systems are not designed for this. So system instability is a risk. And the three solutions which I discussed today are balancing the energy mix, developing the grid infrastructure and interconnectors, and managing the energy flows. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I invite the panel to come up on stage for the Q&A portion. Okay. So we have heard the current and future trends of renewable energy in Asia and the Pacific and going beyond, and what challenges there are that remain when it comes to increasing clean energy solutions, and also what other interventions, particularly grid resilience, that needs to be done for this to happen. Before I open the floor for questions, I have a couple of questions to ask the panelists. Firstly, for Sika, you did mention that the data is publicly available. Where can they access it?
Yeah, so the data can be accessed through the RE Data Explorer platform. The website is re-explorer.org. And so that data can be downloaded for kind of subsequent research and decision-making. The tool is really meant to inform decision-making from the perspective of developers, researchers, energy planners, and departments of energy to help shape kind of broader target setting, but also can do detailed power systems modeling work. So thinking about capacity expansion models, production cost models, the data is at resolution, sub-hourly resolution that can really inform detailed modeling and analysis.
Thank you, Sika. Are there additional information needed to inform the decisions?
Yes, so I think across the different presentations, really trying to stress that a lot of this data and analysis is meant as a starting point. So more analysis is needed for specific sites. And again, when it comes to floating solar, it's a relatively mature market in the Southeast Asia region, but questions still remain. Questions around environmental impacts, questions about deploying these projects on natural water bodies. And so there's really a need for more collaboration. So even though we're providing the data, we still need more data on the actual performance of these systems across the region. And so again, it's hopefully a call for more collaboration between research institutes, developers, different departments of energy, and so on.
Thank you. Yes, I think some of these constraints are being addressed by the TA that's developing these projects in the Pacific. So Agustino, what were the key challenges of floating solar on marine environments, especially in the Pacific SIDS?
Yes, quite a few of them. So we are out there. It's in the lagoons, but it's still a marine environment, near shore environment. So we have winds, we have severe weather events. We have things that we cannot control as much as we control on water bodies. So we had to come up with solutions. So you've seen our approach east-west. The idea is to create and to reduce a way for drag and lift to be much lower than it would be if we actually had one part of the module facing wind, whatever the wind direction would be. Smaller areas and smaller floaters so that actually they can balance themselves in case there is a severe weather event in terms of ondulation. And there is also another that you have not seen, but we are also considering that floaters would also actually be filled with water or partially filled with water so that actually they sit again lower in the water and so they can have a lower profile. So we have been quite, aware of quite a number of challenges that we actually come across these projects under the development.
Thank you. So you mentioned some of the key design considerations. Are there other design considerations that needs to be taken into account?
Well, I think, of course, just the floaters and just the floating systems, as we know, it wasn't enough. You've seen the breakers and you've seen the reefs. So the breaker is something that would give us a bit more guarantee that we will have waves coming to the floaters, which are within the tolerance of floaters and the floating systems that we have currently, commercial, of course. And then the reefs are there with a double, I would say even maybe triple objective. One, of course, because being a reef, it regenerates the ecosystem. Secondly, because in the reef, they are a natural coastal protection mechanism. And third, of course, that we can actually have those reefs as, you know, a last layer of coastal protection or help coastal protection in general. So those are the points.
So the artificial reefs and the wave breakers also function as coastal protection while enhancing fish growth as well, right?
Exactly. That's one of the objectives of the system.
So Morgan, does offshore floating wind face the same, you know, challenges?
Actually, for floating wind, in terms of technical limitations, we can see that it can go in a very harsh environment with T-class turbine. I mentioned this, so it could face typhoon. We have already some pilot projects. We have a small floating wind project, about 30 megawatts. So it's working. Of course, we have not a huge experience in terms of over the lifetime of the project. I would say the main limitation would be more about an economic point of view. And we could expect maybe that the winning technology could be the technology that will use the least amount of material. And as you may know, the higher is the turbine size, the lesser you will use critical material. So currently in the pilot project, you have 5 megawatts turbine. In the current auction, we have turbine of about 10 to 15 megawatts, and in the pipe, we could have 20 megawatts turbines. So I would say in terms of technical limitation, it's working so far. So next step, it's more about having a cheap technology.
Thank you. A question to both you and Agustinho. Have you assessed the type of wave heights that the systems can endure, or currents and wind speeds potentially?
Okay. About wind speed, the T-class turbine could withstand 257 kilometers per hour wind, so it's huge. And for the waves, the technology is working, so it can face a typhoon. I mentioned the semi-submersible technology. What is interesting with this technology, which is the most used for floating wind projects, is that you can have a dynamic ballast to ensure a better stability.
Yes, in the lagoon environment, we have already very good modeling with the support of SPC in the region. So we know what we are going to face under a P90, probably a P95 scenario. So almost close to probably what as high as it may get next to these sites. And we are looking at something that could go up to 3 meters or a bit more. Of course, as you know, Cindy, we are going to measure and to have data that will help us also on monitor how the system will be performing. But we will be also testing the reef in terms of design to see if it can effectively absorb those heights so that we can actually be assured that there is a layer of protection there.
Okay. So you need to over-design in a way to be able to make sure that they withstand and be sustainable. A question to Christophe. You know, with all of these renewables coming online, variable, intermittent renewables, what do you think is the best way to make the grids resilient? And how do you expand the grids?
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. So as I was saying in my presentation, really one of the, so your question is how do we make the grids more resilient? Well, as much as possible, having grids that are meshed, so where there's the possibility to use them in different ways, and having modern control centers is a very good way of increasing the resilience of the grid, where the control centers can have real-time data and analyze this data in real time and react in real time. Yeah, I think, and obviously good financing, financing mechanisms that can allow the grid infrastructure to be developed is obviously very useful, especially for public-private partnerships.
So what would be the priorities for grid expansion and interconnection in the region?
So I think in the region, an obvious candidate for deeper interconnection or stronger interconnection is the Mekong sub-region, because these countries obviously are close to each other, but they have very different electrical systems as it stands. So a country like Cambodia has a deficit in energy, whereas Laos has a surplus in energy, as does Vietnam, or in different parts of these countries. So that would be a good candidate to start with. Secondly, the island states, Indonesia in particular, needs to interconnect some of the main islands, Philippines as well. And I would say a third area would be around Mongolia, which has a huge resource in renewable energy and has particularly China in the south, but also Russia and Japan and Korea close by that need energy, need green energy. So developing the interconnections around Mongolia, I think, would be a good idea.
Thank you. Just one more question. I do have a lot more, but one more question before I go to the app. Could the risk of collapse of the systems cause a slowing down of renewables, in your view?
Yeah, probably because in particular system operators, transmission system operators and distribution system operators will be very resistant to the arrival of variable renewable energies due to these risks. So it's important that if we want renewables to develop and we want to reassure everybody, all of the players, then the more we increase resilience, the more reassured they will be. So yes, it could be, could have an impact on the development of renewables.
Thank you. So maybe I'll start with some questions from the Events Air app. From Mark M, what percentage of the lake or reservoir can be utilized without damaging the existing ecosystem? What was assumed for the technical potential calculation?
So in our assessment, we use the distance from shore assumptions as a proxy for coverage. So it really depends on the kinds of projects you're looking at. So for much smaller water bodies, thinking about really tiny ponds, we can see a range of coverage from about 25% to even about 80%. That's for a very small water body. But for much larger ones, the coverage percentage is very small, partly because it's a multi-purpose water body. And so it might be for recreation, it's a hydro dam reservoir and so on and so forth. So again, it really depends on the water body and also the shape of the water body, the bathymetry, how it varies in terms across seasons. In some places it gets really dry. And so the design of the system also accounts for how that shape will change over time. So in our analysis, we looked at a range of assumptions. So our assumptions tried to account for excluding water bodies that might be too shallow around concerns, because sometimes when you install the system, if the water body is too shallow, you might hit the bottom of the water body, and then that raises concerns around the stability of the system. And then we also wanted to exclude systems or water bodies that are too deep, where it could get really expensive to build out the mooring and anchoring lines. And then also kind of the variation in the water body shape over the season were also accounted in that distance from shore assumptions in the paper.
Thank you. Another question from Mark M. The floating PV projects due diligence, they conducted solar energy integration or solar integration studies with island utilities to ensure the systems are able to accommodate the floating PV projects, and what operational challenges or changes will be needed. So perhaps this is for Agustin. Yeah, so I guess he's asking whether we consulted the utilities when we developed these projects. I hope I got his question right.
Yeah, so I think maybe grid integration is
yeah.
Yes, so clearly one of the next steps after identifying the site And the potential is obviously to make sure that the grid can evacuate the power and what may also be needed or not in terms of that evacuation. So in the case of my presentation, in Kiribati, we had to add storage and also a 33 kV link, an upgrade. In the case of Tuvalu, for example, the 1 megawatt, it is possible without any additional work on the grid, simply because there's also a lot of BESS available in the grid that is being installed under other projects. So definitely grid studies is part of the whole suite and a very important, of course, aspect of our work.
Okay. And I'll also quickly add examples from a few different projects. So in the US, for example, if you're trying to bring on any kind of project, you need to go through an interconnection study. And so the grid operator leads that study in collaboration with the developer. And so in discussion with a number of partners who are developing floating solar projects, in the US, it's often the first of its kind project. So there are a lot of questions in the beginning about how the system will integrate with other generation technologies on the grid, but the grid operator does that work. And then some discussions with some partners from EGAT in Thailand as well. There, the grid operator has really been leading the deployment of floating solar. And so the grid interconnection, grid integration studies are really a core part of how they identify how floating solar could integrate in the existing generation mix. So long story short, it's a really important part of the process in determining whether the floating solar could be part of the system.
Thank you, Sika. Perhaps a third question from the app before I go to the floor. From Marla A, what are the inherent hurdles in developing interconnected microgrids for archipelagos like the Philippines?
So the technical hurdles will be to do with the subsea cables. The subsea cables have existed for a very long time. So there's no particular challenge in the cables themselves. But what might be difficult is the depth of the ocean at that point. Also, there happens to be a huge congestion in the production of subsea cables at the moment because of all the offshore wind projects. So if you wish to build a subsea cable project, you need to wait before you can actually buy the cables. So that's one challenge. But other than that, it's perfectly possible. You just need to ensure that all the players talk to each other and agree on who's paying for what and who's getting paid for what. And it can be greatly beneficial to the islands that interconnect.
Thank you. I hope that answered Marla's question. Your second question I will answer. I suppose it's meant to me, but I'll answer it later. I'll just ask questions from the floor for now. Okay, so Peter's hand first. Okay. Oh yeah, if you could go to the mic, I guess introduce yourself quickly and then ask your question very briefly, please.
Queue up. Hi, Peter Dupont. I'm an ASEF groupie since 2007. I have a question for Agostino and Dika about, like, part of this is envisioning the future of what solar will look like. For either of you or both of you, do you think in the future the majority of solar will be floating photovoltaic, given the cost of land and then the displacement of agriculture? Just your observations on how you think this will develop. Because I recall when I was at USAID in 2017, I think the largest floating PV plant in the world was like 15 megawatts, and now we're several orders of magnitude higher.
I think it really depends on the context. In some countries, just give a few different examples. In some countries like the US, it's only going to make sense in a few key locations where land is really expensive and there's an abundance of like water bodies like the state of Florida. Here in Southeast Asia, really see an opportunity for floating solar to be a big player. Will it compare to deployment of ground mount PV? I think only time will tell. There are some really important questions we need to answer in terms of the environmental impacts. And until we answer those questions, the deployment, there are barriers there that will slow down deployment. We also kind of studying other countries. There are key policies you need to have in place to really strengthen deployment. We've seen countries like Japan, Korea, and others that really had enabling policies in place. And the same have been done for ground mount PV around the world. So unless we get that in place across countries, it's hard to see floating solar really playing a big role on the global stage.
So I don't believe in silver bullets. So it's a toolbox. PV is a toolbox, ground mounted, floating, agrivoltaics, and it will continue. That's what we've seen. Each country has its own difficulties, challenges. Some countries clearly floating will be big. Kyrgyz Republic, well, Cindy has worked a lot in Central Asia. It's a lot of good examples. Some other countries will be much better doing ground mounted. The case is, for example, Rajasthan in India, one of the states. So I don't think there will be one taking all. I think the solution is for everyone to actually put a little bit, and I think floating is a great solution to enable water bodies. As agrivoltaics is the solution, for example, the agriculture issues that you mentioned, that is actually very dear to us all. So floating solar, keep it coming, and we'll have a lot of opportunities, but will not be the single player.
If I may also answer the question partially. You mentioned Kyrgyzstan, even Azerbaijan. If you fill the water bodies in Azerbaijan, could power the world. That's how much potential there is for floating solar, even on inland. But for land-constrained countries like the Pacific, really floating solar could be a game changer for them, particularly marine floating solar. Next question, please. Yeah. Then you, after.
Okay, hi. My name is Orestes Anastasia. I'm with ICF. It's a global consultancy that focuses on energy and climate change and various other things. It's a pleasure to be here. Fantastic presentation, very interesting to hear about these new technologies. They seem relatively new. And what I was curious about, it's very interesting to hear how resilient they are to different kinds of extreme events and weather. I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about how climate resilience may have been considered in understanding its application, its feasibility in different contexts, particularly over the long term, because climate change is not just the risks we have now, but it would probably worsen, and very, very different scenarios are quite possible. It depends on where these devices are installed, whether it's in water bodies that are full now but may dry out, or sea level rise may affect situations. And I was wondering if there's a second way to think about the issue, which is that because these seem like very versatile types of technologies, whether they're actually possibly more resilient than fixed solar or fixed wind. And I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on those issues. Thanks.
Thanks very much for your question. So for wind, what I can say that we have already some experience with bottom fixed technology. So we have projects running for more than a couple of years now. And another important parameter is all the experience we have gained from the oil and gas sector, which needs some very specific infrastructure offshore. And if we add the fact that now we have a specific turbine that can face a typhoon, I would say that yeah, the chances are good that this technology could work. Of course, we would need to wait over the lifetime of at least one project to see what's happening. But there are many parameters that show that it could work.
One way we do think about resilience is from the hybridization angle with floating solar, pairing it with hydropower specifically. So to your point, with climate change, rainfall patterns are changing, droughts are getting worse in some places. So one thing we've done in terms of research is really trying to understand how pairing floating solar with hydropower could really make a power system more resilient, especially there are a few countries in Southeast Asia, some countries in Africa, in South America that depend a lot on hydropower. And so during periods of droughts, there are blackouts and things like that. So from that angle, there is the resilience value there that we've seen in our research. But in terms of the actual resilience of the structure, we honestly just need more data. We are now in the phase of much larger projects, and so we can actually start to understand, can they withstand extreme weather events? A lot of the initial pilot projects were on relatively stable in terms of climatic, in terms of climate, it was relatively stable. And so you didn't really see those extreme weather events to understand whether they could withstand them. But that is a question we get all the time from a lot of like island nations and just different partners. Can the FPV withstand extreme weather events? And I look to folks like Agostino and developers who are actually doing the work on the ground to hopefully get some of those answers soon.
Just maybe quickly. Yes, we have looked at climate resilience very close for the projects, very close, because these islands unfortunately are disappearing, and this is a fact. And they also have their own plans to mitigate the effects of climate change. And so it's not only about what the climate may bring, but what the mitigation measures for that climate change may also bring to the project. So, for example, in Tuvalu, the reclamation that is being planned for Funafuti will impact where we have actually this planned infrastructure. So we believe that we have been well informed by our reports and by our climate risk analysis to understand how we can design better the systems. And yes, that's definitely one of the very important keys and inputs for the solutions and what we are proposing.
Thank you, panelists. Yeah, indeed, we are learning from the experience globally, and a lot of these systems have endured or have been damaged by extreme weather events. So we're learning how to redesign and to make them more resilient as we go. So it is a very nascent technology, and we are learning continuously. Next, please.
Thank you. Roby Halley with the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples. We advance the recognition and respect of Indigenous peoples' rights in the just transition and also facilitate support for Indigenous-led renewable technologies. My question for the panelists is one, is there any data on the mining that would entail this production of clean technologies? It's a growing concern now, no? The mining of transition minerals, lithium, and the others, because we may reach the target for transitioning out of fossil fuels, but in the end, we will be losing our biodiversity and forests. The second question is on the waste. How do we now, there's this new waste that's being generated with clean technology. Is there any plan on how to manage the waste that would be coming out from the solar panels that would not be used anymore, these batteries that have phased out? And the third important aspect for us, while environmental impact assessment is important, economic and social impact is also important, especially even for these offshore technologies, because our livelihood, our culture, our identity is also in our ancestral waters. For example, the SASI coastal management, traditional management in Indonesia, if these offshore clean technologies would be installed in the water, it has to take into consideration sacred areas, livelihood areas of indigenous peoples, because once you touch that, that would have an impact also to the identity and continuity of indigenous people. So it's important to also look into these other factors. It may be harmless offshore, no, but for indigenous peoples who are in the coastal areas, their continuity and livelihood is dependent in their ancestral waters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruby. Very, very good questions. And I guess speaking from ADB, we have a very rigorous safeguard policy procedures and requirements. We also follow country safeguards requirements when it comes to indigenous people, as well as social and even gender assessments that we make sure to comply with in our project design and our project implementation. So that certainly is being considered very closely.
I just wanted to share a few different examples of how NREL approaches some of those questions. So first, on the supply chain part, we do quite a bit of research and understanding the use of materials across different kinds of technologies. We definitely haven't started it for floating solar, but we do it for ground mount wind and many other technologies. And it really connects to a circular economy research as well. So really trying to understand where there are opportunities for reduction, reusing materials, really also understanding the impacts of the different kinds of materials we use. When we're thinking about floating solar, one of those key materials are the floats that the PV panels are sited on. We're getting questions around, are the plastic that's being used, is that impacting the water quality of the bodies of water they're being sited on? So those are research areas that we hope to dive into in the future, because again, it's, you know, technical potential in deploying the technologies is one thing, but we really need to understand more comprehensively how it impacts the broader ecosystem. And then in terms of kind of how we incorporate indigenous voices and priorities in decision-making when it comes to renewable energy, we have domestic and international strategies and work plans in terms of how that's incorporated in our work. We try as much as possible to engage with many different stakeholders on all kinds of projects. So with floating PV work as well, one area of research that we're really hoping to get into is that equity piece and really understanding. Again, you made a point, there might be a water body that may be a really good site for floating PV. So you need to engage with the community, a country, a state to really understand, do they want that project or not? And how does that inform the final decision on whether a project gets built? So we're the researchers, we try to collect that data and share it with the decision makers, and they make the decisions, but in as much as we can think holistically about some of these questions, we try to do so in our research.
Thank you. And in addition, actually, project developers, I've seen floating solar projects in Korea, South Korea, in Japan, in Singapore, in the UK, QE2. All of these were built on freshwater reservoirs, the water for drinking, actually, for these major cities. And their experience have shown that floating PV does not affect the quality of the water. And so that is one key experience from, I mean, globally that we can draw from in terms of its safety. In fact, it's the water that affects the floating PV more often when the water quality, for example, if it's high salinity, you know, a lot of toxic materials maybe, which we have tried to do in Azerbaijan. It is like a lake that is where oil effluents are flowing into. So it's affecting the quality of the output from the PV, not the other way around. So just next question, please.
Thank you. Daler Kubodbekov. I am representing ADB office in Tajikistan, energy sector. And my question is about floating solar paired with HPPs. And my question, is there any data on CapEx cost per megawatt of this hybrid type of solars which are to be paired with HPP? This first, and second, the area requirements like per megawatt. Is it similar to traditional solar or is it different, and what, if there is any difference? And finally, you, in the first presentation, it was mentioned that you have analyzed the capacity of ASEAN region. Is there any data on Central Asian region for this solar floating PV? Thank you.
Great. So trying to remember all your questions. So to the question around, sorry, do you mind repeating that? So cost. We collect some cost data, but we don't necessarily have publicly available data for hybrid systems yet. There are a few databases out there that I can point you to after that collect project-specific data that could be helpful. To the second question, About the area, yeah. So with floating PV, actually much more compactly packed compared to land-based PV. So you can actually get more capacity per acre or whatever surface area used. And so in our analysis, we represented that by using a slightly higher ground cover ratio, which represents how densely packed the PV panels are. The downside is because you're packing them closely together, there might be some self-shading that happens because they're really close together. But our assumption around the tilt compensates for that a little bit there as well. But yes, they're more densely packed than ground mount PV. And then there was a final question. Yes. So a lot of the databases we use are publicly available and have global coverage. So for example, the water body data sets are global coverage. The infrastructure data sets, I believe, are regional for Southeast Asia, but the RE Data Explorer tool, our global ambition is really to cover the globe. We've done Southeast Asia. There's coverage for, I believe, USA and parts of that region. And we're also moving into Africa as well in coming months. So it depends on really demand. If we get enough demand from the region and of course funding to cover our work, then we're able to do that. But happy to have more discussions about that after.
Agustina.
Well, we've been involved in the Central Asia technical assistance that Cindy mentioned. So Azerbaijan, Kyrgyz Republic, and Afghanistan, exactly mapping floating out of these three countries. So answering your question in terms of costs, of course, differ between regions, and Central Asia is a very specific one, and Tajikistan is even more specific than Central Asia. I would put probably prices in Tajikistan 0.9 to $1 million per megawatt. That's probably the number. In terms of area, we have used 1.25 hectares per megawatt. That's the assessments we have done when we mapped the countries. So we mapped Afghanistan, we mapped, of course, Azerbaijan and the Kyrgyz Republic in terms of the FPV potential. And this is a number that allows you for some flexibility, a little bit like what Zika mentioned. So around, the tilt that you're going to be considering. Of course, if it is the lowest tilt and very compact designs as the one that we are using in the Pacific, you don't need so much. But 1.25 gives you a fair amount of area that you could do that. So we can provide you, and I'm sure that ADB has that data. So we have done those for the Central Asia, and one of the objectives of the TA was to share them in CAREC. So this is something that obviously Tajikistan can also get them and then see how these countries were mapped in this particular aspect.
Yes, so of course I designed and led that TA in Central Asia when I was still in CWAN, but there's a new project officer that you can work with. He could have the available data on the mapping for floating in Central and West Asia. We have less than 2 minutes left, but there's still so many interesting questions here. We have an interesting one. When looking at offshore PV and wind, has consideration been given to visual pollution, taking into account tourism activities? This is from David Knight.
Yes, this was definitely one concern that we had from at least Tuvalu, and Kiribati is also not an exception, but we got it more from Tuvalu. So we tried to get the design, which is, again, as I said, very low in terms of profile. So it's not, if you look into the distance, you won't be seeing a lot of things, just, again, very slightly lined. So we don't want anything. Of course, offshore wind is pretty much different than what we're talking about. But the low profile that we are planning also aims at reducing the visual impact, especially because these islands, of course, they are in the middle of the Pacific. This is what they are used to see, is a very, blue type of ocean. And now we will have something that will be covering, which won't be so different than blue, which is good. And again, we tried obviously to make sure that visually it will not impact too much. So this is also definitely one of the concerns we have for the options on floating PV. I don't know, Morgan, on wind you may.
No, for wind, we aim at higher wind turbines. So maybe it's not going the good way, but at the same time, for floating wind, we are quite far from the coast. Current projects are at 10, 15, 20 kilometers, and we could go further. So it might not be a big issue if we are very far away from the coast.
Thank you. I mean, I hope the audience will still indulge us for a couple more minutes. There's some very interesting questions still left here on the app. But to answer also that visual pollution thing, actually, in the South Korea floating PV site I visited, they had actually a viewing deck. So they have they made it into a tourist site for people to actually come and visit. It is also quite attractive for tourists, and that's something we also sold to Tuvalu. They can also make it as a tourism site. Yeah. A question from Giacomoji regarding floating PV on or offshore and also floating wind. To what extent are risk insurance products available and their cost to cover damages, etc.?
Well, I think, the bank has their own products for that, and other development banks as well. So this is definitely one of the very important ones. We are looking at an IPP setup or a triple PPP, a PPP structure. In our cases, we have budgeted, of course, on EPC contracts for the public sector that there will be some kind of insurance, but nothing similar to what is required for an IPP. So what we have seen in the case of Tonga, and not entirely for a floating PV, but more for a ground-mounted PV, is that there were solutions that were provided by the private sector to actually de-risk and provide solutions for that. But the insurance products is definitely something that we are trying, and the design also aims to that, not to change dramatically the commercial product, so that, of course, the guarantees of the product still apply, they're not voided. And secondly, that you can actually access, insurance for, generally speaking, solar PV projects, which includes also floating PV. So again, we're not moving too much away. That was also one of our objectives, is still being commercial and still be within the commercial realm, so that, we can mitigate these aspects. But it's one that doesn't have a clear answer.
Thanks, Agustinho. Yeah, indeed, that is one challenge that we are facing, particularly in the Pacific, where you have very small islands and very small, projects, in fact, in terms of financing. So collectively, with other development partners, we are looking into the insurance packages that we could potentially provide more on a regional basis to make it more attractive and actually effective. You okay for more questions? We have another one here from Akhtar A. I think this was answered. He asked about the potential for floating solar in Southeast Asia. He's saying we see some of the companies engaged in undertaking projects in islands. So I think that was covered in Sika's presentation, Southeast Asia. But please feel free to approach our speakers after this session. They are certainly available for to address some of these, because we cannot cover everything today. But get their information. Maybe you can email your questions to them as well. Any other burning question from the floor, perhaps? Okay, please. It's the last one.
I promise this will be quick. Bansari Saha, by the way, I'm also with ICF. You heard about our firm doing a lot of work in clean energy. First of all, thank you. It was great to hear about all these new technologies that are being implemented in this part of the world. It's really glad to hear that. My question, Morgan, for you is, when it comes to floating offshore wind floating technology, you mentioned, I think, roughly 20% is the projection for how much you could get from offshore wind, in this region, if I got the number correct. I'm curious, what kind of policies do you think would be required to get to that kind of a penetration level? Do you see those policies being talked about, discussed? And if not, what do you think is the path forward to get to that kind of a potential of 20% offshore wind? Thanks.
Thanks very much for your question. Right now, floating wind is not a very mature technology, so we'll need every policy where you could imagine for non-mature technology. I think the next challenge for floating wind is to scale up. So for instance, you will need very different infrastructure for ports. You show that the SPAR technology with 100 meters draft, it's very large, so you will need very specific equipment. There is also a need for specific materials, so to develop the supply chain. And then you would need some specific energy policy to ensure that you can support this technology up to maybe 2030, 2035 when it will be competitive. So because it's not mature right now, I think we need all the policies.
Thank you. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The future of renewable energy in Asia and the Pacific certainly looks promising, but challenges remain, including grid infrastructure, including financing, including regulatory barriers. So those are, of course, works in progress that we continue to do. But certainly with the push for cleaner and sustainable energy, I think the future for renewables looks bright. Join me in thanking our panels again for very interesting presentations. And also sticking to the time. Very good. Thank you so much. See you in the next session. We have 4.2 as well, still on resilient energy. Thank you.